I'm Richard Taylor from Marquette University, and together with my colleague, Professor Andrea Robilio at the Catholic University of Leuven, we present to you this course on Thomas Aquinas on the nature and attainment of happiness, taught at our universities thanks to a transatlantic connection using the internet and Polycom video, taught in fall 2014. This is class number 8 on Averroes and Augustine on ultimate happiness. And this is video 8b, focusing on Augustine's De Videndo Deum, but also I add an addendum here on the issue of Latin Averroism and the real doctrines of Averroes. So let's proceed. So in this video, I'll review with you some of what we've read in Augustine's De Videndo Deum, so that you may have a sense of the importance of the vision of God in the Christian tradition, which was so foundational to the thought of Aquinas. But as I said just a moment ago, I will also supplement this with an addendum to what I said in video 8a on Averroes regarding the issue of the confused development of an epistemology and metaphysics of happiness in Latin Averroism, very different from the thought of Averroes himself. So let's begin with Augustine. This is an important treatise since Augustine covers so many scriptural texts on the issue of ultimate happiness in seeing God. It gives us a sense of how important it was, how important this issue was to Christian theologians, but of course it is important because it's at the very heart of the promise of Christianity that human beings will return to God in the afterlife. And of course for us then it's particularly significant because it was a text very well known to Aquinas and his 12th and 13th century fellow theologians. Augustine clearly sets out the many senses of seeing, which are not unlike our usages in contemporary English. You see what I mean? Right? Let's consider some valuable remarks at the start of his little book. He says the following, quote, "What then shall we say? Is it enough that we say that there is this difference between seeing and believing? Namely, that present things are seen while absent ones are believed? This is perhaps quite enough if we understand that those things are in this passage said to be present that are available to the senses of the mind or the body, for they are called present, because the word is derived from this." Notice, by the way, his use here of the senses of the mind or body. "For that way I see this sunlight by the sense of the body, and in that way I clearly see my will as well, because it is available to the sense of my mind and is present to me interiorly." So he's using these two senses. He wants to talk about the senses, the sense of the mind and the sense of the body. And so this is a kind of apprehension of some kind that is appropriately called sense, even when it's attributed to the mind. This is very different from the kind of terminology one finds in the Aristotelian tradition of Averroes and others of the Aristotelian tradition. But I continue. "But if someone whose lips and voice are present to me reveals his will to me, because the will that he reveals to me is nonetheless hidden from the sense of my body and of my mind, I believe. I do not see." So that's a matter of belief. When someone tells me what he or she is thinking, I do not see it, and it's not appropriate to say that I see it. Rather, I believe what I am told. He goes on, "Or if I think he is lying, I do not believe, even if things are perhaps as he says. That is because I think he's lying." He continues then, "We believe those things then that are not present to our senses if the testimony that is offered to them seems suitable. But we see those things which are available, and for this reason they are called present to the senses of either the mind or the body." So seeing is going to refer to some immediate experience and immediate presence of things to us, and be quite different from the nature of belief. He goes on, "And for this reason they are called present to the senses of either the mind or the body, that is. For though there are 5 senses of the body, the senses of seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, and touching, sight is of course mainly attributed to the eyes, though we use this word with regard to the other senses as well." And he then illustrates this. He says, then we do not, after all, merely say, see how bright it is, but also see how it sounds, see how it smells, see how it tastes, see how hot it is. Nor should you understand that because I said that things not present to our senses are believed, those things that we once saw and retain and are certain that we did see are to be counted among those things that are believed, though they are not at that moment present to us when they are recalled by us. So we don't probably see them, we believe them and remember them. For they are not counted among things believed, but among things seen, and they are not for this reason known, and they are for this reason known. And I'm going to start this part of the video over, I think, because I think I've misunderstood what he is doing. And I'm going to go back to the 5th slide. So delete this and start it again when I do this countdown. And the countdown is this: 3, 2, 1. Augustine then continues, we do not after all merely say, see how bright it is, but also we say, see how it sounds, see how it smells, see how it tastes, and see how hot it is. Nor should you understand that because I said that things not present to our senses are believed, that those things that we once saw and retain and are certain that we did see are to be counted among those things that are believed, though they are not at that moment present to us when they are recalled by us. Rather, and he goes on, for they are not counted among things believed, but among things seen. That is because we saw them earlier, and we apprehended them earlier. And they are for this reason known. Not because we had faith in other witnesses, but because, without any doubt, we recall and know that we have seen them. Close quote. So he's making very clear the vocabulary and the nature of the seeing and knowing. So seeing is something we retain in our memory, something that we have seen something. Believing is something quite different. So we don't distrust our own memories in this way by saying that I believe I recall such and such a thing, etc. Our knowledge, he writes, is made up of both things seen and things believed. So that's another explanation of what's going on here. Knowledge consists both of things seen and immediately apprehended by me in that sense, and it also involves things believed. So we can believe certain things, have knowledge of certain things through belief. That is, there are things we have seen for ourselves and things which witnesses have witnesses have provided testimony. That his concern is to find a way to group scriptural uses of seeing in a way that displays a coherent religious approach to the texts in the text is quite evident. He expresses this at 14, that is on page 326, where he writes the following. By what rule of interpretation shall we prove that these statements that seem opposed and in conflict are not opposed and in conflict? For it is in no way possible that this authority of the Scriptures is not truthful. So his task in much of what follows is just to provide contextual interpretations to show a coherent account of the Scriptures on the issue of seeing God. In the course of doing this, Augustine establishes that it is not we but God who is the determinate cause for the sight of God. God decides whether to reveal himself to us in sight, to our sight. Further, what is sought is the vision of God himself, not some finite form that God wills to represent him. Augustine writes, by nature, therefore, God is invisible, not only the Father, but also the Trinity itself, one God. And because he is not only invisible, but also immutable, he appears as he wills, in what form he wills, so that his indivisible and immutable nature remains whole within him. But the desire of truly pious persons by which they long and avidly desire to see God does not, I believe, burn to gaze upon that form in which he appears when he wills, which is not himself, that is when there's some representation, but rather to gaze upon that substance by which he is what he is. So the pious truly desire to see God as what God is in himself. And that's what's promised in Scripture, to see God face to face. And that's ultimate happiness. Regarding this notion of seeing the substance of God, Augustine writes, quote, "Next, one can ask how the very substance of God could be seen by certain people, still situated in this life, because of what was said to Moses. No one can see my face and live. Unless the human mind can be taken up by God from this life to the life of angels before it is released from flesh by this common death." Close quote. Later, he speaks of, so those are among the issues he's dealing with here, but later he speaks about spiritual vision, and he says this, "Certainly it is clear that, where he said, 'we know,' he spoke of that knowledge that comes by faith, the faith from which the righteous now live, not the contemplation by which we shall see God as he is." So the different senses of know is involved here as well. For as a consequence, he desired this latter for himself and for us, and signified that it was to come, when he said, "He deigns by his mercy to fill us with all the fullness of God in order that he can be seen by us." He also writes this then regarding the fullness of God. "Some have understood this fullness of God, of which the apostle speaks, in such a way as to think that we will be precisely what God is." Notice the point here. We will become noetically identical with God. Some have understood that. For the apostles set forth these words, as you see, when he was speaking as follows: "Also to know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge, in order that you may be filled with all the fullness of God." That's a scriptural passage. "Hence they say, if we shall have less than God and shall be less in some respect, how shall we be filled with all the fullness of God? But since we shall be filled, we shall certainly be equal to him." That is, there's going to be an identity. We are in some fashion absorbed to and made equal to God, which Augustine, of course, is going to reject completely. "I know that you, of course, reject and detest this error of the human mind, and you are right. But we shall discuss afterward, if God is willing, in accord with the powers he has given us, how this fullness is to be interpreted, of which it was said that we will be filled with all the fullness of God." Of course, being filled with that is to be filled with divine grace, and in order for us to be able to be fulfilled in the highest way in seeing God. For the vision of God, of course, moral purity is required. So he writes, "But for that vision by which we shall see God as he is, he warned us to make our hearts clean. For because in the ordinary way of speaking visible things are called bodies, God is said to be invisible in order that he may not be thought to be a body. Not because clean hearts will be deprived of the temptation of his substance. For to those who worship and love God, this is promised, as the Lord himself says, as a great and supreme reward when he will appear visibly to bodily eyes. And he promised to allow himself to be seen, though invisible, by the clean of heart." And the scriptural statement, "Whoever loves me will be loved by my Father, and I will love him and show myself to him." Continuing then, this nature of his is, of course, equally invisible along with the Father, just as it is equally incorruptible. The apostle, as we said, put these ideas one right after the other, teaching human beings in what words he could about the divine substance. If bodily eyes will see it in the resurrection after the character of our bodies has changed, that is, the body is glorified, let those who can defend this view see it. I am more influenced by the statement of Ambrose, who did not attribute this to bodily eyes, even in the resurrection, but to clean hearts. So here he follows Ambrose in the notion that even the glorified body will not be seeing God with bodily eyes, even in the resurrection. but rather the statement really concerns seeing God in virtue of a clean heart. Augustine took, of course, a great deal from his understanding of the writings of Averroes, as you know from reading the treatise, reading this text. Quote, "If you approve of this, hold with me that view of the holy man Averroes. That has now been confirmed not only by his authority by truth, but by the truth itself. For I am not pleased with it just because the Lord set me free from error, especially through the words of that man, and granted me the grace of saving baptism through his ministry, as if I were favoring him too much as one who planted and watered me. I am rather pleased with it because Averroes also said what God, who gives the increase, says to one who thinks piously and understands correctly. Quote, in the resurrection, therefore, it is not easy to see God except for those who are clean of heart, and for this reason, blessed are the clean of heart, because they shall see God. How many others did the Lord list as blessed, and yet he did not promise these the ability to see God? If then those who are clean of heart will see God, the others, of course, will not see him. After all, the unworthy will not see God, nor can someone see God who has not wanted to see God. Very interesting account here. He then continues with this notion, especially explaining the nature of God and how God is seen. He goes on, nor is God seen in location, but by a clean heart. Of course, God is invisible and can't be seen. God's immaterial, etc., but seen by a clean heart. And so now the notion of seeing is transferred to the notion of purity. So purity is seeing, and a clean heart is what sees. God is not, let's continue. God is not sought by bodily eyes, nor enveloped by sight, nor held by touch, nor heard by words, nor perceived by his walk. And when he is thought not to be there, he is seen. And he is not seen when he is there. Finally, not all the apostles saw Christ, and for this reason he said, I have been with you for so long a time, and have you still not known me? For one who has known what is the breadth, length, and height, and depth, and the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge, has seen Christ, has also seen the Father. And of course, he's not talking about physical seeing here, but he has come to apprehend and have confidence in his experience. For we no longer know Christ in terms of the flesh, but in terms of the Spirit. And we'll be talking about Spirit shortly. Christ is the Lord after all, Spirit before our eyes. He deigns by his mercy to fill us with all the fullness of God in order that he can be seen by us. Notice this. Notice what's going on here. So God in his mercy fills us with all the fullness of God, that is the grace of God, in order that he can be seen by us. So God must fill us up with the ability to see God through grace, because we do not have that ability of ourselves. So it requires this supernatural gift from God to enable us to see, and that is to make us receptive, not giving us the power that by our own powers we can see God immediately in some fashion, but rather he fills us up so that he allows us to see him, not by our own power, but by the fullness of God and the fullness of divine power given to us through grace by God. While this account of Augustine is founded on thoughtful religious interpretation of scriptural passages, it's also a valuable account of his understanding of the meanings of statements about human seeing of God. This work is often cited and used by theologians, including Thomas Aquinas, who draws on it in his commentary on the sentences, as well as in other works. This short review of this work should remind us both that the vision of God was essential to the Christian view of ultimate human fulfillment, and also that considerable work has to be done to show that this religious finality in seeing the essence of God will require subtle philosophical recounting to bring it together with the finality of Aristotelian intellectual happiness and fulfillment. That isn't an easy connection to make, and it has to be, but nevertheless it has to be done. Now, a bit of an addendum on Averroes and Latin Averroism. In video 8a, I spelled out in detail Averroes' account of human knowing in his long commentary on the De Anima. I did not explain to you his various theories of knowing in the short commentary on the De Anima in the early period, the same period as his commentary on the Parva Naturalia, nor did I explain his understanding in the middle commentary on the De Anima. He had three distinct positions with regard to human intellectual understanding and its development. One is the early period of the short commentary and also the commentary on the Parva Naturalia. Another is the middle period, which is the middle commentary on the De Anima, and his final period, which is the long commentary on the De Anima. There are three very distinct understandings of the mechanisms whereby epistemological understanding and metaphysical understanding can come to take place. So, I spelled out in detail the account of human knowing, and I explained the ways in which conjoining with the separate agent intellect and the separate material intellect made human intellectual understanding a reality. I did not say anything about connecting with God and becoming identical with God and that sort of thing in the genuine thought of Averroes. There I mentioned that the Latin European thinkers who received the works of Averroes came to have an interpretation radically at variance with that of Averroes himself. Now, carefully picking through the works of Averroes, the Latins crafted a view that held that ultimate happiness could come through intellectual thought, even to the point of ultimate fulfillment in knowing God. That is not at all the view of Averroes. The reasoning proceeds as follows. 1. The material intellect is the most receptive of all things, and so it is able to receive the illuminations from higher separate substances. 2. The agent intellect provides forms to the human intellect and itself is able to know other separate substances. 3. Through conjoining with the material intellect and the agent intellect, human beings can enable themselves to have the highest kind of happiness, that is, to know intellectual separate substances, the most perfect of which is God himself. And 4. Hence, there is a natural path to God open to intellectuals without the need of religion. Let's look at each of these. There are severe problems here, and they're grounded in a confusion about the nature of the works of Averroes. His paraphrasing commentary on Aristotle's Parva Naturalia, with his famous treatise on dreams, is from the early period of the thought of Averroes, when he held that each human being has his or her own material intellect, and the separate agent intellect function to provide intellectual understanding to humans through representations of the intellectual forms in the agent intellect. But they also had the late commentary on the De Anima, where Averroes rejected that earlier view and set out his own mature account, which was explained in video 8a. But the Latins had no conception that Averroes had developed different doctrines in different periods of his life, and rather they took all of this to be somehow the thought of Averroes, and they proceeded to find a way to reconcile the texts with one another, a very imaginative way that does not represent the thought of Averroes at all. So the result was a mixture of widely differing teachings from the early and late works of Averroes, which the Latins, without considering the different periods and accounts, as I said, treated as part of the firm and unchanging doctrine of Averroes. So, with regard to number 1, the material intellect is the most receptive of all things, and so it is able to receive the illuminations from higher substances. This notion mixes the receptivity of the material intellect for abstractions made from experiences of the world with the notion of the reception of illuminations revealing the essences of separate substances, the goal and prize constituting ultimate human happiness. But Averroes never said any such thing about the material intellect. 2. The notion the agent intellect provides forms to the human intellect and itself is able to know other separate substances is from the earlier teaching of Averroes and not at all consonant with his conception of the abstracting agent intellect in the long commentary on the De Anima, where the agent intellect functions only in 1. Providing primary principles of understanding, and 2. Being the abstractive power posited to explain abstraction and transference of intelligibles in potency into being intelligibles in act. 3. Through the conjoining with the material intellect and the agent intellect, human beings can enable themselves to have the highest kind of happiness, to know intellectual separate substances, the most perfect of which is God himself. In his long commentary on the De Anima, Averroes is explicit in indicating that the human intellect, or cogitative or imaginative power, is bodily and perishable. I mentioned, by the way, that the human intellectual understanding he sometimes identifies with the name cogitative power, meaning all of those internal powers of the brain, or imaginative power, again, a kind of encompassing term that includes all the powers of the brain in this. Conjoining with separate substances, in his case, means only conjoining with the material intellect and the agent intellect solely for the end of the particular human being to attain knowledge during its brief natural and physical lifetime. So we will not rise up and see God. There is no finality here of that sort. We are not that kind of entity. Recall the readings that we looked at in video 8a on this, the reading from the long commentary on the metaphysics and the readings in the long commentary on the De Anima. Finally, 4, hence there is a natural path to God open to intellectuals without the need of religion. Well, he does say something along the lines of this sort of thing in his long commentary on the metaphysics of Aristotle. And there on page 10 of his long commentary in the Buige edition, he says that there is a Sharia, or a religious law, that belongs peculiarly or particularly to the philosophers, and that Sharia is to know God in the science of metaphysics, and to know God's creation in the science of metaphysics. And he describes this as the most perfect kind of worship that can be given to God. Nevertheless, he does not say that we unite with God, that we see God face to face. Rather, the science of metaphysics will give indications of the nature of God and arguments for the nature of God, but those arguments will have to be demonstrations quia, or hoti, not propter quid, or deity. The essence of God is not apprehended as such by Averroes. There is another way to think about this. In a sense, we do apprehend what is in God's mind insofar as we apprehend teleology in all its moments and its overall direction in this world. Because that teleology it moves toward God, moves everything toward God, moves everything toward perfect actuality to the extent possible. Still, that's not seeing God himself. For Averroes, then, this statement is true, but the path to God is only through reasoning and demonstration quia hoti, as I just said, not through some kind of illuminative intellectual reception and final conjoining with separate intellects. Not at all. Averroes does say that when we become all the intelligibles, we are united with the agent intellect. But the sense is that this is the human being who attains fullest intellectual understanding, that this, the human being who attains highest intellectual understanding, is knowing at the highest level, connected with that intellect in what Themistius called a godlike state. But this is metaphorical and hyperbolic language on the part of Averroes, and is merely meant as an imitation of the wonder of Themistius at the nature of human knowing, not a statement about conjoining with God for Averroes. Well, let me stop here now and leave the rest of this for classroom discussion.